Greetings and welcome to America in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is the Center Square's Washington, D.C. bureau chief, Casey Harper. We are recording this on Friday, July 28th. Casey, it's been a bit of a whirlwind week in the case of Hunter Biden, President Joe Biden's son, in the investigation into tax evasion and other allegations against him. He was expected to plead guilty this week on tax evasion charges. Really, after a bizarre plea hearing, he changed his plea to not guilty. What's going on here?
Yeah, this was bizarre is the right word, Dan. I mean, this is very unusual. This was supposed to be basically a routine court hearing. They had already worked out the details. We've reported on those details and talked about them, at thecentersquare.com and on this podcast. So
weeks ago, right?
Yeah, right. And that's how these big, especially these high profile cases where someone has a big legal team, can afford a really big legal team. It's going to be drawn out. It's going to be very deliberated. By the time you show up in court for something like this, all the ducks should be in a row. But there's a few things that happened that kind of shook it up last minute. This didn't come up in court, but it seems like there's a really good chance that someone actually impersonated a lawyer on the prosecution side and called the judge and tried to manipulate what court documents actually the judge had access to, which is a wild, unprecedented, crazy thing. And, I don't think we've fully gotten to the bottom of that, but that didn't come up in the court hearing. So that disturbed the peace a little bit, you could say. And then when they showed up, there was really a dispute over whether, Hunter Biden could be charged again for certain crimes, like, for example, violating for the Foreign Agents Registration Act, right? Or whether this plea deal gave him broad immunity. And the judge kind of pressed on this and said, it's kind of an unusual deal. There's a lot of things that don't usually happen about it. And there's a line of, you can, if you plead guilty to something, obviously, like you don't want to be charged again. That's kind of part of the deal, is that you agree that, yes, I plead guilty to these things, but this is all you're going to charge me with, and we move on. But there's still investigations ongoing into Hunter Biden. Honestly, you can't keep track of all the investigations. There's the FARA stuff. There's more related to his father and bribery scheme. It's just kind of an ongoing
alleged
investigation.
Bribery, yeah.
Right, exactly. And so, how can you create a plea deal with him when he still has these other outstanding things? And if he pleads guilty to this stuff, to what degree does he have immunity, or is he protected from potential future charges? And that really is the crux of where things fell apart. They called a recess. They tried to work it out. And they really couldn't come to an agreement. So they're going to have a future court date. And for now, Hunter Biden has pled not guilty, but he could change that. And I think there's a really good chance he will again strike another plea deal. But, it's definitely an interesting development.
Yeah, in advance of this week's plea hearing, Republicans in Congress had urged the judge to reject the deal because of these other allegations against Hunter Biden and his father, this alleged the business dealings that the Biden family had when President Biden was then vice president under President Barack Obama, with these foreign entities, and whether or not these foreign entities paid the Bidens for their influence, essentially, on foreign affair matters. Is that what this is about? Is that why the judge had concerns about this? What do you know? I know there's a lot that we don't know still, but what do we know about that?
Well, yeah, there's a few things we know. Right, you're right that the Republicans immediately, even before the latest revelations, they called this a sweetheart deal. They were pretty upset about it. Felt like it was special treatment. And then we found out from the IRS whistleblowers who testified before Congress after this deal was struck, but before this plea hearing where it all fell apart, we found out that the Department of Justice really interfered, according to these whistleblowers, in the investigation. They slowed it down so that certain alleged crimes would be past the statute of limitations. They interfered with what interviews were allowed and how evidence was collected, which of course is huge. So we even know now that investigation into Hunter Biden, in particular on the tax issues, was really manipulated for very possibly for political reasons, according to the IRS whistleblowers. So that's really a big thing. Second, we know that the FBI released this informant document. Now, it is just a document, it's just one informant who's anonymous, but they laid out a lot of accusations that really tie Hunter Biden and the president to this kind of alleged bribery scheme, in quote unquote bribery scheme that has been, the big question all along. And so I think the problem Republicans have with this is, hey, wait a minute, we still haven't gotten to the bottom of whether this bribery scheme is real, and we have evidence for it. And Hunter Biden's lawyers keep talking like, all right, once we accept this plea deal, you can never charge us for anything ever again. And I think they are kind of projecting that and trying to make that true, like will it into existence and get it on the record somehow. But that would be really unusual. I mean, you can't just take a plea deal for a few narrow tax charges and be protected for all crimes in perpetuity.
So what's next? Because I mean, the Department of Justice has been accused of essentially interfering in the Hunter Biden case. Well, they're still the prosecutors here. So how does anything change from here? Do you have any idea what's next here?
How does anything change in Washington, Dan, or the federal law enforcement? Man, that's the question. I mean, this isn't the first time that federal law enforcement in the last few years has been accused of corruption. And of course, we've talked a lot about the different ways that they've handled different, the way they handled riots, the way they handled January 6th, the way that they've interfered with, free speech and social media companies, the people they've prosecuted, and the way they, hunted down January 6 people, but didn't really seem to have the same vigor when it came to the BLM riots around the country. So, I mean, how do things change is going to be a next presidential race question. In the short term, I think that there is a real pressure on the Republicans who really want to see something done about this to get the evidence out in the public. I mean, I think they had a big win with that FBI document that Senator Grassley released because they had to fight tooth and nail to get that document. They threatened to hold the head of the FBI in contempt Comer did, to try to get that document. And then they released it publicly, even though the FBI was really upset that they did that. So I think that's the short-term strategy for them. They have to get more evidence because it's, people just assume it's political, and it kind of is partially political. Of course, it's the Republicans who want the evidence. So because it's political, because it's the president's son, I think you need more and more evidence. And then the other thing, what's next? Your question is, what's next is President Trump is going to keep having his hearings and keep drawing closer and closer in his own prosecution and potential ramifications, potential jailing. I mean, they keep ramping that up. So they're going to have this increasingly difficult juxtaposition of Trump coming into prosecution and Hunter Biden, even as more evidence comes out, seemingly not.
All right. You said President Trump. Of course, you meant former President Trump, unless you're making
Correct.
a prediction about the
No, I am not.
election. Okay, that's good to know. Well, it seems to be that congressional Republicans are the one that's driving this investigation into Hunter Biden and the president. The DOJ seems to be either slow walking or not interested in some of these other allegations, for example, these bribery allegations. So I just don't know how those two are going to mesh in the future. One last thing, we're almost out of time, Casey. President Biden was asked this week after the plea deal fell apart whether he would pardon his son, Hunter Biden. He didn't really have a response, did he?
No, he kind of just walked away and ignored the question, which has been his response often to these questions about this topic. But the White House press secretary did seem to say that he would not pardon actually Hunter Biden. So, you could always walk that back, but it's interesting that we do have some indication there.
Ahead of the 2024 presidential election, I think it would be risky for the president to pardon his son, but who knows after the election is over. He still have a window, whether he loses or wins re-election or not, to pardon his son. So that's going to be something that's going to be a cloud, I think, over his campaign. Casey?
You're right about that. The real question is, if I was your son and I was a struggling drug addict who had used your name to make money all around the world, would you pardon me?
Casey, I play things by the book, whether you're my relative, my blood relative.
Oh, man, you'd let me rot away in prison?
See ya. I'll visit.
Oh, my gosh.
I'd visit.
You visit. Wow.
Yeah,
how touching.
All right, Casey, we're out of time. Thank you for your insight into this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Casey Harper, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.